Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. There have been an amazing set of international reports that have culminated in a meeting, an international meeting of the Conference of Parties in Poland this last week. This is the meeting of all the signatories to the Climate Accord, and even though the United States is not a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, and our current administration has announced plans to distance itself, withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which was signed by the previous administration, it still attended the meetings, and as we'll see, was thoroughly humiliated before the world because of the positions it took and the attempt it made to try to sell fossil fuels as a future solution to the problems facing the world. It was really very embarrassing, so much so that there were disruptions to the conference on several fronts, from youth groups, indigenous groups, women's groups, and a 15-year-old student from Sweden, speaking perfect English, scolded the world in a dramatic statement about what's not being done. So today we're going to look at, in a sense, a climate and sea level update that we do from time to time, but today we're going to look in particular at the problem of how, before the world as a whole, the youth challenge, the fatal myopia, greed, and childishness of the Trump generation. It's not just the Trump administration, and it's not just Trump. It would be convenient if we had an individual upon whom this could all be blamed. But that's much too easy. It's the Trump generation, the generation that thinks it can get away with the endless use of fossil fuels and the profiting of that use. The coal industries, the petroleum industries, the automotive industries, the petrochemical industries, the pharmaceuticals, everyone who's brought Trump to power and keeps him there. We have senators from oil states like Jim Inhofe and Mitch McConnell from a coal state. All of this is terribly myopic, extraordinarily greedy, and childish in the extreme. At the same time, the science is strengthening every day. The IPCC report was put out in October, 2 months before the meeting in Poland of the Conference of Parties, 24th year they've met. And the IPCC report was staggering in its implication. Take a look.
For the last few decades, the threat of human-caused climate change has been heavily studied and reported. The scientific consensus is now clear, and we've seen a shift away from why is this happening to when will the worst happen, and finally now to how exactly will this happen. We know massive, potentially catastrophic changes are just around the corner, and the scientific community has shifted its attention from whether humans are exacerbating climate change to exactly what kinds of disasters to expect. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the recent IPCC climate report and break down what changes we can expect to see in the near future and beyond. Before we go any further, we need to establish a baseline for understanding. There will be climate change deniers in the comments. There always are. But these people are a very vocal minority. There is no longer any doubt that human activity has drastically affected the rate of climate change, and we have mountains of peer-reviewed evidence to prove it. If you're one of the people who believes climate change is a hoax, just consider who would benefit from you believing that lie. Fossil fuel advocates, special interest groups, and members of the current US and foreign governments who are heavily dependent on the fossil fuel industry for donations. They are selling your future and your children's future for a quick buck. Look at the evidence, do your research. This shouldn't be controversial. Every single person on Earth, regardless of political leaning or beliefs, would benefit from the actions recommended by the IPCC report.
Every single person on Earth will benefit from the IPCC report, and it's only those who are heavily bought out by the fossil fuel industries who are trying to make it a buck on the last sale of the last ton of carbon, without any regard to the impact of that on the future of the world. It's only those people who keep denying things. Meanwhile, the scientists from all over the world, especially those looking at the Arctic, are emphasizing it's much more dire than we thought.
Scientists have issued a new warning on Arctic warming. A report released this week finds the Arctic been warmer over the last 5 years than at any time since 1900, the year record-keeping began. The region is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet.
Twice the rate of the rest of the planet. Now, we've, in previous weeks, talked about the implications of that, including sea level rise and the change of ocean currents, which will directly affect our livelihoods here in the Boston area, in fact, around the world. And the science is gaining credibility even within the United States, not just the intergovernmental panels or the Arctic reports, but the reports made by the administration itself that the president has not been able to suppress. Take a look.
The government issued its most dramatic report yet about climate change today, and it came with a dire warning. Scientists said the country is already feeling major effects of climate change, and it has already cost the United States hundreds of billions of dollars. The report, which was issued by 13 federal agencies, also highlights how climate change is expected to have a significant impact on the future of the economy. The report links climate change with extreme events like Hurricanes Maria and Harvey, and longer, more intense, more frequent western wildfire seasons. And scientists say there's more to come. The continental United States is already 1.8 degrees warmer than it was a century ago, and the temperature may rise by another 2.3 degrees by 2050. Unless more is done, the risks and impact of climate change are expected to shrink the U.S. economy 10% by century's end. David Easterling of NOAA, which released the report, suggested in a media call that climate change would damage the country's infrastructure, economy, and human health.
The global average temperature is much higher and is rising more rapidly than anything modern civilization has experienced. And this warming trend can only be explained by human activities.
While almost no one will escape the effects of climate change, scientists say underserved and lower-income Americans, as well as coastal communities, will feel the brunt most immediately.
Future generations can expect to experience and interact with natural systems in ways that are much different than today. Without significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, extinctions and transformative impacts on some ecosystems cannot be avoided.
The assessment is a stark contrast with the views and policies of President Trump, who often denies or dismisses the role of climate change. Today, scientists wouldn't say whether the White House pushed to have the report released on the afternoon after Thanksgiving.
Okay. Well, what's with that? What's with releasing a report which he didn't have any control over? It was Congress that mandated this report, required the 13 agencies of government to get together and write the report for Congress, not for the president. It had to come out with this report. It realized that if we were trying to suppress it entirely, there would have been a huge uproar internationally. So what do? They try to effectively suppress it by releasing it on a Friday afternoon, the day after Thanksgiving, when everyone is encouraged to go shop. What's called Black Friday. Well, it's very, very interesting because the international community saw exactly what was happening. Even the American press started to report it. NPR did.
The giant new government report says climate change is already hurting communities in the U.S. It was supposed to be published in December. The White House instead chose to publish it today, Black Friday, despite opposition from many scientists. In a few minutes, we'll hear from one of the scientists who contributed to the report. First, NPR's Rebecca Hersher explains wildfires, floods, droughts, and air pollution are all worse because of global warming, and yet scientists say there's hope.
The story of this climate change report actually starts almost 30 years ago.
This White House conference on global climate change was expected to begin about 15 minutes ago.
It's halfway through the first Bush administration.
George Bush, President of the United States.
When Bush takes the stage here, it's April, and the White House is feeling the heat, so to speak, on global warming. A United Nations panel had just published its first report ever saying that humans are causing global warming, and it seemed to demand action of some kind.
And that's why I've asked Congress, our Congress, to approve a 60% increase in our budget for the Global Change Research Program.
And a few months later, Bush signs a law that requires that research program to publish national climate assessments every 4 years.
Okay. This is the George H.W. Bush that just died, right? He required Congress to vote on, and they unanimously voted for the creation of a national climate assessment that has to report every 4 years. This is that latest report, required by the first George H.W. Bush, recently died, and ignored ever since by every Republican administration that's been in power, especially that of his son, George W. Bush. We're in real trouble here, because to ignore for 30 years the reports of your own government agencies is very myopic, short-sighted, one might even say stupid. The British understood this right away and covered the reason for this cover-up.
You're listening to News Hour from the BBC. I'm Razia Iqbal. Now to the impact of climate change in the United States. Volume 2 of the National Climate Change Assessment has been published today, and it underlines an unmistakable message from scientists that they are more certain than ever that man-made climate change is impacting the US, and it will be expensive. Some are arguing the publication of this volume has been brought forward to try to bury it a day after the Thanksgiving holiday in the US. I've been speaking to Michael E. Mann, who is a climate scientist and author. What does he make of the fact that this congressionally mandated document has been published now?
Thanks, it's good to be with you. So we know that earlier on, the Trump administration actually considered trying to actually bury the report entirely, prevent it from coming out. And I think they realized that the political repercussions of trying to do that would be even more adverse. And so what they've done clearly is to try to bury it instead by releasing it during a holiday weekend, the Thanksgiving weekend, this Friday called Black Friday in the United States. It's one of the busiest shopping days of the year. And I think their intention was to essentially obscure the report by forcing it to be released into the oblivion of this holiday weekend. I think that's actually backfired on them because the narrative of the Trump administration trying to bury this critical report has actually, in my assessment, generated even more media interest.
Okay, so tell us exactly why they might want to bury it. What's in it?
Yeah, well, so it lays out in stark terms, as you very nicely summarized, the fact that there is no longer a debate about human-caused climate change or the fact that we are seeing the negative impacts of climate change now play out in very vivid terms. And for your viewers who live in the UK, who experienced this record heat wave this summer, throughout the Northern Hemisphere, we saw unprecedented heat and droughts and wildfires and floods and superstorms this fall that make it very clear that the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. They're playing out in real time. That's inconvenient to an administration that has tried to dismiss climate change as a hoax, that has essentially been doing the bidding of powerful fossil fuel interests like the Koch brothers in trying to dismantle the environmental protections put in place by the last administration and previous Republican and Democratic administrations.
Okay, we don't have much time, but I wonder if you could just outline for us what the report says that about certain groups who are likely to suffer far more than others as a result of climate change.
Sure thing. Well, the report, again, there aren't real surprises here in the sense that the report is based on existing scientific literature. It's just summarizing that literature. And what that literature demonstrates is that the impacts of climate change are going to be felt the hardest by those who have the least resources to deal with them. The poor, the developing world, folks who have the least resilience have the...
Okay, well, you get the point. Very clear to the world. And yet, despite the stronger evidence, the president says this.
I've seen it, I've read some of it, and it's fine. Yeah, I don't believe it. No, I don't believe it.
Okay, to get that clear, he's seen the report, he's read some of it, he says, apparently not the conclusions, and he says it's fine. But then when asked about the economic impact, he goes on to say, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. Now, these are the world's best scientists reporting in the IPCC, the government's best scientists in 13 agencies reporting to him in this fourth assessment report, and a deliberate attempt to squash the report, and he finally just says he doesn't believe it.
Goodman. We end today's show with the alarming new climate change report that the White House tried to bury by releasing it on Black Friday, one of the slowest news days of the year. The 1,656-page government assessment directly contradicts President Trump's history of climate change denial, warning human-driven climate change threatens human health, will continue to lead to more extreme weather conditions, and could shrink the U.S. economy by as much as 10% by the end of the century. The findings are a sharp rebuke to the Trump administration's insistence that environmental regulations hurt jobs and hinder economic growth. The major new study, known as the National Climate Assessment, was mandated by Congress, is based on the work of 300 scientists and 13 federal agencies. The study says the consequences of climate change will leave no part of the U.S. untouched, and that the warming climate will increase wildfires, crumble infrastructure, worsen air quality, destroy crops, lead to more frequent disease outbreaks. In Alaska, communities will be forced to relocate due to coastal flooding and erosion. In Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, salt water will taint drinking water. Fire season may spread to the southeast. The report also puts a shocking price tag on climate change, projecting climate impacts of $141 billion from heat-related deaths, $118 billion from sea level rise, and $32 billion from infrastructure damage by 2100.
Okay, that's what's coming. This is said now not by a handful of scientists, but by the world scientists and by the America's best scientists. It's in that context that there's been this meeting in Poland this last week. And the United States listened to the challenge.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
Okay, well, Sir David Attenborough, the world's most famous naturalist, spoke to the whole group, and yet the United States joined Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Kuwait to block the adoption of the UN climate report, the IPCC report. Furthermore, they put on a session to promote fossil fuels and nuclear energy as a source of addressing climate change, just the 180 degrees around from what's needed. There were activists who stood up and said, no, keep it in the ground, and we can follow those in detail in the future weeks. But most powerfully, this 15-year-old woman from Sweden spoke up. Take a look.
We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Katowice, Poland, where world leaders are gathered to negotiate climate solutions that could dictate policy for years to come. But we begin today's show with a climate activist who says politicians here are not doing enough to turn back the clock and prevent catastrophic climate change. 15-year-old Greta Thunberg. She has made international headlines since launching a school strike against climate change in her home country of Sweden in September. She sat on the steps of the parliament in Stockholm every school day for 3 weeks leading up to the Swedish elections to demand that politicians take more radical action to stop global warming. After the election, she went back to school 4 days a week, but every Friday, Greta continues to sit outside the parliament building in protest. Her actions have inspired thousands of students across the globe to do the same. Greta Thunberg has Asperger's syndrome. She has focused with laser intensity on climate change since she was 9 years old. She brought her message directly to world leaders here in Katowice at the UN Climate Summit last week. This is Greta addressing UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
For 25 years, countless of people have stood in front of the United Nations climate conferences, asking our nation's leaders to stop the emissions. But clearly, this has not worked since the emissions just continue to rise. So I will not ask them anything. Instead, I will ask the people around the world to realize that our political leaders have failed us. Because we are facing an existential threat, and there is no time to continue down this road of madness. Rich countries like Sweden need to start reducing emissions by at least 15% every year to stay below a 2-degree warming target. You would think the media and every one of our leaders would be talking about nothing else, but they never even mention it. Nor does hardly anyone ever mention that we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, with up to 200 species going extinct every single day. Furthermore, does no one ever speak about the aspect of equity clearly stated in the Paris Agreement, which is absolutely necessary to make it work on a global scale. That means that rich countries, like mine, need to get down to zero emissions within 6 to 12 years with today's emission speed. Because how can we expect countries like India, Colombia or Nigeria to care about the climate crisis if we, who already have everything, don't care even a second about our actual commitments to the Paris Agreement? So when school started in August this year, I sat myself down on the ground outside the Swedish Parliament. I school striked for the climate. Some people say that I should be in school instead. Some people say that I should study to become a climate scientist so that I can solve the climate crisis. But the climate crisis has already been solved. We already have all the facts and solutions. And why should I be studying for a future that soon may be no more, when no one is doing anything to save that future? And what is the point of learning facts when the most important facts clearly means nothing to our society? Today we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. So we can no longer save the world by playing by the rules, because the rules have to be changed. So we have not come here to beg the world leaders to care for our future. They have ignored us in the past and they will ignore us again. We have come here to let them know that change is coming, whether they like it or not. The people will rise to the challenge. And since our leaders are behaving like children, we will have to take the responsibility they should have taken long ago.
Right. They should have taken long ago. We will have to take it. Before the world, the youth challenged the fatal myopia, greed, and childishness of the Trump generation. It's extraordinary. It's an aspect of a new kind of alliance.